After Patrick Swayze was done dancing dirty in the Catskills, he went on a 3-year streak of hit movies. He started off with a bang doing Roadhouse in 1989, and then the next year he tackled a more dramatic role in Ghost. To cap off his streak, he returned to the action genre by starring in Point Break. These 3 movies would be the peak of his career. We'll take a look back at the first of these 3 films on the next Back to the Feature.
Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
We first get introduced to Patrick Swayze as Dalton, the badass head bouncer at a fancy nightclub. Everyone is having a great time until a couple of guys get rowdy, and Dalton has to step in and handle the situation, all the while keeping calm and cool. After the altercation, Dalton meets Frank Tilghman, who is the owner of a bar called the Double Deuce just outside of Kansas City. He offers Dalton a job to come clean up his bar and make it respectable again. Dalton asks for $5,000 up front and $500 cash per night, plus all medical expenses, and Frank quickly agrees. The dude gets paid. When Dalton gets to Jasper, Missouri, he heads straight to the infamous Double Deuce, and it's kind of a shithole. He goes inside and sees drunk people fighting, waitresses being harassed, and drug deals right out in the open. The house band, led by Jeff Healey as Cody, is playing behind chicken wire to keep them safe from flying beer bottles. A big fight breaks out, and Dalton just watches as the fight involves most of the patrons and goes on forever. Lots of tables and chairs are murdered, and bottles are flying around like hand grenades. The next day, Dalton goes shopping for an old beater and then buys a bunch of extra tires. And it seems strange to buy extra tires, but here in a little bit you'll see why he does. He then rents a modest room in a barn owned by a nice old farmer named Emmett. The barn is peaceful and secluded, overlooking a river. Across the river, though, is not so peaceful. The local corrupt businessman Brad Wesley lives across the way and likes to fly in and out in his helicopter, spooking Emmett's horses. Ben Gazzara really plays Brad Wesley to the hilt, and you can tell he had a good time playing the bad guy. Later that night, there's a big meeting at the Double Deuce. Frank has gathered all the employees together to announce his new plans to renovate the club and to introduce Dalton as the new head bouncer, or cooler as they're called. The first thing Dalton does is fire a few people. Morgan, you're history. You're too much of a hothead. Waitress with no name, you're gone too. Drug dealing is bad. Then they get the speech.
It's my way or the highway.
There are 3 simple rules to follow. Number 1.
Never underestimate your opponent.
Number 2.
Take it outside. Never start anything inside the bar unless it's absolutely necessary.
And number 3.
Be nice until it's time to not be nice.
Before the night is over, a couple more employees are let go, including the bartender Pat. He's been skimming money and he's pretty cocky about it because he happens to be connected to Brad Wesley. You can tell that firing him is going to come back and bite Dalton in the ass somehow. When Dalton leaves work that night, we finally see why he bought all the extra tires. It seems like some folks in Jasper just don't like tires having air in them. The next day, Dalton visits Red's Auto Parts, which is owned and operated by a nice fellow named Red, of course. Red is actually played by Red West, who you might remember as a member of Elvis Presley's inner circle, known as the Memphis Mafia. He's there to order a new windshield, and while they're at it, they get to chatting. Brad and one of his goons show up and greets Dalton as he's leaving. Back at the barn, Dalton gets in some personal time while harnessing his chi or something. It's all very zen. It's another rowdy night at the Double Deuce when Pat returns demanding his job back as the bartender. He brought along a couple of Brad's goons to make sure it happens. And remember when I said this would come back to bite Dalton? Well, it turns out that Brad owns the distributor that Frank gets his liquor from. Oh, and Brad is Pat's uncle. None of this seems to faze Dalton, not even after Pat pulls out a big knife and starts acting tough. And it quickly turns into an official brawl as Dalton finds himself fighting Pat and the 2 goons, one of which takes out a knife and cuts Dalton in the ribs. The fight is over just as quick as it started because the bad guys can't fight worth a shit. The other bouncers take out the trash while Dalton goes off to the hospital. In the ER, he meets Dr. Elizabeth Clay, played by Kelly Lynch. She's impressed when he whips out his medical file that he always carries with him. It's not his first rodeo after all. He's going to need some staples, but he refuses a local anesthetic, which leads her to ask if he enjoys pain. His response?
Pain don't hurt.
Yes, it does, Dalton. That's why they call it pain. She proceeds to staple him back together, and he doesn't let out a sound. Mind over body, people. We also learn that he has a degree in philosophy from NYU. Dalton shows up at Red's just as Brad's main goon, Jimmy, drives off. Once inside, he finds the place ransacked and learns that Dr. Clay is actually Red's niece. Then he learns that Brad has all of the local business owners pay him money to stay in business. Dalton reaches out to an old friend. It's his mentor, Wade Garrett, played by the always badass Sam Elliott. Not much comes of this conversation other than to introduce Wade to the story. Things are already starting to improve at the Double Deuce since Dalton arrived. The chicken wire is no longer in front of the band, and there are more people there to dance and enjoy the live music. Brad's friend Denise hits on Dalton, but he ain't having it. Jimmy comes up and escorts her outside, where Brad's other goons are out there waiting for their signal to go in and start some shit. Let's call these 4 guys the B team, with Pat and the first 2 goons from before being the C team. And that leaves Jimmy all by himself as the A team. The B team makes their grand entrance and are instantly greeted by Dalton and the other bouncers before they can get all the way in. Following Dalton's rule number 2, they quickly drag the B team outside and beat their ass while everyone watches. Even the good doc showed up just in time to see Dalton in action. The next day, Dalton gets a visit from the C team, who tell him that Mr. Wesley would like to see him. Back at Brad's house, we first see Denise working out. She has a big old shiner, which I guess she got for coming on to Dalton. We basically have to sit through Brad telling Dalton how it's his destiny to gather as much wealth as he can grab. Then Brad brings up the fact that he knows Dalton killed a man in self-defense back in Memphis. And you can tell by the look on Dalton's face that it's a bit of a sore subject for him. Brad then asks Dalton how much it would cost to come work for him. And just like with Denise, he isn't having it. The exterior of the Double Deuce now has a new makeover, and there's a line of people waiting to get in. It looks like Frank's plan for the club is working out, and Frank checks in with the new bartender to see how they're doing on the liquor supply. It's running low, he says. And yes, that is Keith David playing the bartender. How are you going to waste an actor as good as Keith David like that? Doc is waiting outside for Dalton when he gets off work. He takes her back to his place where he puts on some music, and then they enjoy some sexy time while Brad peeps from across the river. The next day, Dalton learns that there's some history between the Doc and Brad, and then there's an issue with the new liquor delivery. As the driver is unloading the crates on the dock, the C team shows up with a couple of extra hands. They start busting up the bottles, so Dalton takes on all 4 guys. He holds his own for a few minutes, but by the time the cavalry shows up, he's on the losing end of the fight. Lucky for him, the cavalry comes in the form of Wade Garrett. And that's pretty much the end of that fight. Dalton takes Wade to go pick up the Doc, and they spend the whole night telling war stories. By morning, Doc can't believe the men aren't tired. And in just a wee bit of foreshadowing, Wade says,
Doc, I'll get all the sleep I need when I'm dead.
It's another smooth night at the Double Deuce until the night is interrupted with sirens. Turns out that Red's auto parts store is on fire. Correction, Red's auto parts store blew up. Thankfully, no one was inside though. It's all quiet back inside the bar as Brad, along with Denise and all of his goon teams, are there. Brad makes the band play something so Denise can dance around as slutty as possible. By the time Dalton approaches to escort her off the stage, she's decided to turn it into a striptease. Always the gentleman, he successfully gets her back to Brad and drops a great insult about keeping his pet on a leash. The comment doesn't bother Brad, but it pisses her off. Brad signals for his real pet to come over. That's right, it's time to bring in the A-team. Mr. Jimmy himself is finally called into action. This guy thinks he's hot shit. He saunters out to the dance floor carrying a pool cue. He clears the floor and then starts twirling it around like it's an Olympic event. He motions for the bouncers to come take him on, and with Dalton's approval, 3 of them take their first crack at him. As the 3 bouncers engage Jimmy, Brad signals to the other goons to start shit everywhere else. They start fights and start busting up stuff, and Wade and Dalton jump into the fray as Jimmy takes down the bouncers with his trusty pool cue. Then it's Jimmy versus Wade to see who can kick harder. It's a bit uneven as Wade has an obvious weak spot with his knee and Jimmy goes after it. Just as Jimmy goes to put Wade down, Dalton steps in. And now it's an even fight. Unfortunately for Jimmy, boss man Brad doesn't think he could beat Dalton, so he fires his gun in the air to get everyone to stand down. And then like a petulant child, he takes his goons and leaves. The local business owners get together with Dalton and the doc to figure out what their next move is. Pete, the car dealer, asks Red if he has insurance so he can rebuild. Red's feeling pretty defeated, so that's a no. And Frank points out to the others that the only thing Brad is afraid of is Dalton. Back at Pete's Ford dealership, there's a bit of a commotion going on just as Dalton, Doc, and Cody are driving by. Brad and his goon squad are out tormenting Pete. Now this scene was a popular one in the theater because monster trucks were super popular in the 80s. The truck used in this scene is Bigfoot 7 and was built specifically for the movie. Brad directs his guy to drive the truck through the dealership, and that's exactly what he does. While a crowd of people stand in the parking lot, the driver takes that truck straight through the showroom floor of the dealership. In the process, he straight up murdered 4 station wagons, which to me didn't seem like that big of a loss. Brad is pretty happy with the results, and then Dalton watches as the doc confronts Brad about his behavior. Dalton is pissed and storms off as Brad faces down Pete, Frank, Red, and Emmett, reminding the men that this is his town. Brad walks away, leaving Pete steaming over the damage that was done, and it doesn't help that Red then asks him if he has insurance. Smart ass. When Dalton is pouting, he likes to work out by punching and kicking stuff. Wade tries to talk some sense into him by trying to convince him that the bullshit with Brad isn't worth it. The pep talk isn't working though because Dalton is hard-headed. So much so that he even takes a swing at Wade. But swinging at Wade and hitting Wade are 2 different things though. The doc catches up to Dalton at the barn and she gets the same reception Wade got. He has decided that he's the only one who can stop Brad. Their argument is interrupted when Emmett's house explodes in flames with him in it. Dalton rushes into the burning house to rescue Emmett, while that jackass Brad watches from across the river. Dalton spots Jimmy leaving the scene of the crime and goes after him. And they finally get to have their macho showdown with no one to stop them. The whole fight kind of reeks of the Karate Kid. I was just waiting for the doc to yell, "Sweep the leg." It's a pretty even fight as they beat the shit out of each other for a while, and Dalton finally gets the upper hand. And then Jimmy decides to skip to the end by pulling out a gun. So the first rule of pulling a gun: if you intend to use it, you should probably just pull the trigger and not stop to tell the person you're going to shoot them. While Jimmy is busy jabbering, Dalton kicks the gun out of his hand just as it goes off. He then does his signature Mortal Kombat finishing move where he rips his throat out. Doc screams in horror as she watches Dalton kill Jimmy with his bare hands. Jimmy ends up face down in the river and Doc rushes to his aid. "You're too late, Doc. He's a goner." She looks up at Dalton like he's a monster and she storms off in a huff. And Dalton calls out Brad from the riverbank as he shoves Jimmy's body further out into the river. The next day, Dalton arrives early to the Double Deuce where the phone is ringing and it's his old friend Brad. Now what could he possibly want so early in the day? He tells Dalton that he has to choose who dies today, Wade or Doc, and then he hangs up. Just then, Wade comes stumbling in. He's beat to hell but alive, so Dalton figures that Doc is the target. He leaves to go get her, and then he and Wade are going to leave this town for good. Dalton finds Doc at the hospital and tries to force her to leave, but she's not having it. All she can think of is him killing Jimmy. She throws him out, so he heads back to the Double Deuce where he finds Wade sleeping on the bar. He goes to wake him up and finds a big knife sticking out of his chest. So yeah, he's dead. You can't wake a guy up from a dirt nap, Dalton. He pulls the knife out and jumps back in his car. Brad took shit too far this time. At Brad's house, the goon squad is waiting out front, heavily armed. They spot Dalton's car coming straight at them, and it almost seems like they knew he was coming. They open fire on the car, and it ultimately crashes in a ball of fire. When they open the car door, there's no driver, just a knife stuck in the gas pedal. That Dalton's clever. At this point, Dalton is basically Rambo as he makes his way through the house, taking out each one of the hired goons one by one. Eventually, Brad is the only one left. Well, except for Tinker from the C-Team, who manages to get stuck under a giant taxidermied polar bear. Brad gets one shot off that wings Dalton in the shoulder, but Dalton's so pissed that it doesn't even slow him down as he starts beating the crap out of him. Of course, Brad doesn't play fair, so he grabs a spear of all things and starts swinging it at Dalton's bad arm. Brad realizes that he can't beat Dalton with his fist, so he picks up his gun where he makes the same mistake Jimmy made. He could have just pulled the trigger, but he had to start yapping again. This gave Dalton the extra second he needed to kick the gun out of his hand and prepare for his signature move. He raises his clawed hand up, ready to strike like a snake, but stops himself. Brad just ain't worth it, and with perfect timing, Doc comes running into the room, which causes Dalton to turn his back on Brad. And Brad's slimy ass goes for his gun to take advantage of the moment. But he starts yapping again instead of just pulling the trigger. And then suddenly, Brad is shot in the side, and we see that the guy with the rifle is red. See, he didn't say a word, he just fired the gun. That's how it's done, Brad. Even though he's wounded, Brad still tries to take a shot at Dalton, but he gets shot again. This time by Emmett. Boom, another shot hits him. This one from Pete. Brad's a tough son of a bitch though, he refuses to go down. So Frank steps up, reminds Brad that this is their town, and then delivers the kill shot, sending him crashing through the glass table. Red gathers all the rifles when they hear the police sirens approaching. And when the police come in asking for an explanation, they all clam up saying they didn't see anything. So that's it. Brad and his guys are all dead and things are back to normal. The Double Deuce is doing great and Dalton has decided to stay in Jasper with Doc. The end. Roll credits. When this movie came out, the critics hated it. The fans, mostly guys in particular though, loved it. Myself included. It had lots of dudes getting punched in the face, monster trucks smashing cars, and gratuitous nudity. It's the perfect 80s action movie. There was a remake done that starred Jake Gyllenhaal that wasn't too bad. But I think I preferred the original though because it was more grounded in reality. What did you think of Roadhouse? Who did it better, Patrick Swayze or Jake Gyllenhaal? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below to help grow this channel. I appreciate you taking time out of your day and hope you will come back for the next Back to the Feature.